Okay, thank you, Savitri. This is the second in our series. And we looked last time at our responsibility towards the subject or the academic discipline that we research and we teach. Today, we're going to look at our responsibility to the students. And I told you that this quotation from Abraham Kuyper will be like the motto that runs through our whole series. Last time I also said that it's important that as Christians, and especially as Christian academics, that we develop a deep, rich theology of creation, which is something that's lacking in many evangelical churches, sadly. Creation is a philosophical doctrine. It's very different to creationism, which is a biological theory, an outdated biological theory. But often there are Christians and many non-Christians who confuse the two. So I said last time that when we use the language of creation, we are speaking of dependence, we are speaking of relationality, we are speaking of the givenness of the world to us, we are speaking of order, of both physical and moral order that underlies the world. And when we speak of us as human creatures, the fundamental distinction is between the creator and the creature. That's us, who are limited, who are finite, but who, as human beings made in the image of the creator, have a responsibility, and we also have an intrinsic dignity and intrinsic value or worth. I also said that the God who's revealed in Scripture is a God of history, and so it's important that we bring a historical perspective to everything that we do, to our universities, and especially to the subject that we study and teach. So today we're going to look at teaching and also the way we relate to students, both our non-Christian students and Christian students. I assume that as teachers, you are all qualified to do that. You understand your subject in sufficient depth, that you have the academic credentials to teach. But I'm going to look at 5 areas that are often not discussed when it comes to teaching. But as Christians, we need to pay attention to these 5 areas. Firstly, at motivation. This is a quotation from a famous Muslim theologian, philosopher of the Middle Ages. He writes, "My teaching was concerned with branches of knowledge which were unimportant and worthless. My motive in teaching was not a sincere desire to serve God, but that I wanted an influential position and widespread recognition." And as you know, there are many in the academic world who are there because they in fact want an influential position and widespread recognition. But the Christian motivation for teaching is this desire to serve God and to serve our neighbor. Secondly, we need to pay attention to how we communicate that love for our subject that I spoke of last month. A Christian academic should be passionate about what he or she is teaching. And here I have a quotation from one professor who writes, "The face of the professor is a place where students look to understand what it means to love a subject. In moments of exquisite attention, the correspondence between the story of the inner life of the teacher and the story of the inner life of the subject lights up the room. This is true of a bird's nest, a rock, a work of art, a history, a holy book, a poem, or a doctor's rounds in a hospital." Many of us came to study what we study because we were infected with a passion for it by a teacher, maybe a teacher in high school, who communicated a passion for a particular subject. Or you think back even at your university teachers, maybe there was someone whose passion for that field motivated you to do a PhD in that particular field. So we make the classroom a more personal place when we also communicate our personal story. Perhaps when you start a course, you could very briefly just tell students, what is it that made you want to teach such a course? What was in your personal history? Who were the teachers who influenced you? What were the books that you read that made you excited to study and to teach this particular course? The worst thing that a teacher can do for students is to sort of teach a subject in a very boring, unlively, uninteresting way that just kills interest. And to be very good if sometimes you were to ask a colleague to sit in and to listen to your teaching and to give you some advice as to how you can actually communicate your material in a way that's personal, in a way that's lively. Not entertainment for the sake of entertainment. I mean, there are dangers in that. But if you truly love your subject, it has to come out in the way that you communicate it. Here is that same academic writing further. She says, as I moved into higher education, I became aware of an outspoken prohibition against telling personal stories in the classroom. One of the narratives that teachers owe to the students is the story of the discipline itself, at least in overview, as well as an account of the professors, authors, and other mentors who have influenced this particular teacher. The purpose of telling these stories is not to create clones of the professor, but rather to make invisible influences more visible, and therefore to make one's theoretical grounding more transparent. Undergraduates often have little or no comprehension of what forces go into the making of the subject before them. So not only our personal story, but I would encourage you, like I did last time, to also perhaps introduce students to the history. Perhaps even the first lecture in a course of lectures could be on the history of your particular subject or sub-discipline that you're teaching. Where are we coming from to the point of knowledge where we are now? And what are the significant people, the significant discoveries that shape this? So recommend that people read. And we can talk about this later, or also next month when we look at what we can contribute to the university as a whole. Then thirdly, there is what I call mutuality in learning. In other words, a teacher and a student and a group of students should form a community of learning where teachers learn as well as teach. Parker Palmer, who is a well-known educationist in the US, writes, to sit in a class where the teacher stuffs our minds with information, organizes it with finality, insists on having the answers while being utterly uninterested in our views, and forces us into a grim competition for grades. To sit in such a class is to experience a lack of space for learning. But to study with a teacher who not only speaks but listens, who not only gives answers but asks questions and welcomes our insights, who provides information and theories that do not close doors but open new ones, who encourages students to help each other learn, to study with such a teacher is to know the power of a learning space. Then, fourthly, we expect of a teacher, and especially a Christian teacher, but all teachers, to practice integrity. Moral integrity and intellectual integrity. What do I mean by intellectual integrity? Well, the willingness to admit ignorance. If somebody asks a question and we don't know, we don't have to pretend. We can say, well, let me check that up and let you know tomorrow or the next time we meet. In areas where there is a diversity of views, it means having the honesty to say so. And perhaps even inviting somebody who has a very different view to ours on a particular topic to maybe come and speak to our class and give his or her different point of view. And this is especially important in the social sciences and the humanities, perhaps less so in the natural sciences. Intellectual integrity also implies that we admit when we have changed our mind. Now, this is not something that often happens in the academy. You will have professors who will fiercely, staunchly defend their views because their whole personal reputation depends on it, especially if they've taught a particular view for 20, 30 years. But we have rare examples of academics, many famous ones, who do admit that they have changed their mind on a particular topic. I mean, Einstein is a famous example who frankly admitted that he made a mistake with what is called the cosmological constant in physics. Another is a Nobel Prize winning economist called Paul Krugman, who writes regularly today for the New York Times. In his early years as an economist, he believed that all economic outcomes were shaped by, say, technological changes in society. And then later, as he lived through the George Bush years and he saw the way that political decisions were shaping what kind of economic outcomes emerged, he admitted that politics was important and you could not separate public policy or politics from economic theory. So a Christian academic should be the first to admit when he or she has actually changed his or her mind on a particular topic. That's not something to be ashamed of. That is simply an example of humility, of integrity. And that's also linked with apologizing, saying to students that we are sorry. Perhaps we've treated a student unfairly, talked to a student rudely in the classroom. Well, a Christian academic should openly, publicly apologize to the student. And in that way is modeling for the student, again, how we need to learn to apologize to one another. This is, again, something that we rarely see in South Asian societies. We don't see it in politics. We don't see it in the academy. And when a Christian professor or a Christian teacher apologizes to students, then that is actually a very powerful Christian testimony. The power of apology, of asking for forgiveness. And this also then leads me to the fifth area that we should be concerned about, and that is the moral formation of students. Here is another American professor who teaches in American college writing. Through their example and in the way that they moderate classroom discussion of ideas among students, instructors compel their students again and again to treat the ideas of others with care and respect, even as they must often criticize and disagree with them. The cultivation of virtue involves primarily the formation of good habits through repetitive actions performed as virtuous people would perform them. These teachers are instilling certain virtues in the lives of their students. So like I said, not only apologizing, not only admitting when one changes what our minds, but also learning to listen to a viewpoint with which we disagree, identifying where we respect the other and where we disagree with the other and why we disagree with the other. This is a way that we model what it means to be moral citizens. We model virtue to our students and we encourage them to do the same with each other. We also need to give students a bigger vision for their studies and also for their lives. It would be lovely if Christian lecturers, professors were to talk with students as they begin a particular course of study and simply ask them, why have you chosen to study this particular discipline? What is it that motivates you? Just as I said earlier, the teacher has an opportunity in the classroom to share his or her own motivation. Obviously, you cannot preach in the classroom. You shouldn't use the classroom to quote from the Bible or to preach Christian sermons. That's an abuse of your power, and you lose your job. But just as you can, but there's nothing to prevent you from asking questions. And just like Jesus did, often asking questions is a way that we push people to think about what they do and why they do them. What is the foundation for their lives? So, for example, if you're a medical professor, you can tell your students, well, if you want to study medicine just to make money, may I suggest that you're in the wrong field, because you will only corrupt medicine. And we have perhaps enough corrupt medical doctors. Why don't you become a businessman instead if you want to make money, if that's your motivation? And also in the final year of their studies, you need to be asking them that very basic question. Now, what are you going to do with the education that you have received? Who is going to benefit? Are you going to use your studies to make the rich and the powerful in our society richer and more powerful? Or are you going to use this to empower those who are weak, those who have not had the privilege of a university education? What are you going to use your studies for? Are you going to allow powerful people to use your knowledge, say of IT, to make our society more tyrannical? Are you going to allow business corporations to use your knowledge of psychology simply to exploit people, to motivate them to work harder so that the profits of the company will increase? You can ask those questions, which are profoundly Christian questions because they are moral questions, and nobody can accuse you of abusing your status, your position as a teacher. Then how do we as Christian teachers relate to Christian students? Well, if you're in a university where there are no Christian students at all, or maybe you've not found a Christian student group, a fellowship, how do we actually perhaps go about trying to encourage one? Because you're concerned that there should be a Christian witness in this place. Perhaps you could begin in your local church by finding out if there are Christian students from your church in the university. Or if there is a staff worker of the national IFES movement, whether it's UESI or Focus, try to meet with that person and ask them, or go with that person to a few churches and find out if there are Christian students in the university, and then encourage them to get together, to meet together, not just to repeat what they're doing in their churches, not to, in other words, just start another church on the campus, but to talk together as Christians coming from different churches about what it means to be a Christian in the university. How do they relate their Christian faith to their studies and what they're going to do with their studies? Or how will they address issues in the universities, issues of justice, issues of violence, like ragging, for instance, issues of discrimination, say against international students or students from ethnic minorities, or sexual abuse, or how can they together as Christians relate to non-Christian students? You know, those are the kind of questions that a Christian fellowship should be discussing and studying. And as a Christian academic, you can encourage them to do that. So where there is already a Christian student group in your university, I would encourage you and other Christian lecturers, or if there are Christian administrators, to suggest that you all come together with those Christian students. And if there is a staff worker around, invite him or her as well. And maybe get together once a term, that is, say 3 times a year, just to talk together about some of the challenges in your university. And this is something we'll take up next month when we look more broadly at our Christian witness to the university as a whole. Thirdly, and this is the most important thing, your Christian contribution to Christian students is to be a role model for them. They'll be watching the way that you teach. How are you different from other teachers? In the way you teach your subject, the way that you engage with students in the classroom? Do you show the integrity that I referred to earlier? What is your Christian influence amongst your fellow academics? I often tell Christian students, you have a ministry to Christian professors or lecturers. That is, you go to them and get them out of their offices or their labs or whatever, and you challenge them to be more visible as Christians. Now, there are some Christian professors whom we don't want to be visible. I remember when I was an undergraduate student, there was an academic advisor to our Christian Union who was a brilliant physicist, very eminent in his field, but he came from a very narrow, what we call a fundamentalist Brethren church. And he was writing these pamphlets, these tracts, attacking evolution, teaching, creationism, that God had made the world in 6 days. And he wanted us as students to use these tracts in our personal evangelism. And we students, 19, 20 years old, we had to tell him, so we can't use these. We'd be a laughing stock in the university. And we had to educate this physicist on how not to read the Bible, at least not to read the early chapters of Genesis. Now, not many students, especially in South Asia, would do what I, as a 19-year-old student, as a young Christian did, challenge a Christian professor. Fortunately for me, there were other Christian professors in the university who were role models. When I look back, they were the people who I didn't know personally, but whose Christian integrity taught me that I could be a Christian and an intellectual without contradiction, without contradicting myself. I think of someone like Sir Norman Anderson. You may come across some of his books. He was professor of Islamic law in the University of London. He helped to draft the Egyptian constitution in the 1950s. He was an expert on Islam and Islamic law and a deeply committed Christian, a lay leader in the Church of England. And he was knighted, and he would unashamedly not only give his public academic lectures in university, but he was willing to be invited by the Christian group to give talks in the university on topics like, say, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, bringing his legal mind to bear on the question, examining the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And he would also talk about Christianity and Islam, or teach Christians on how to relate to people of other faiths. There was another professor, Donald Mackay, who started a group, Christians in Science, in Britain. He died early, but his books had an enormous influence on me as a young Christian studying science and engineering and grappling with the issue of how to think Christianly as a scientist or engineer. So it's because of those role models, and like I said, I didn't know them personally, but I had the privilege of hearing them speak in public, in the university, that I am still a Christian today. It wasn't pastors, it wasn't theologians. And there is nothing quite as powerful in a university setting as a Christian scholar who is respected by his or her peers for their scholarship, but who is also so well thought through theologically, philosophically, that they can get up and give a clear, rational, and relevant talk in the university. And when you have such a person like that, it attracts many students and faculty. And I pray that in every, maybe to ask for it in every university, maybe to ask too much, but can't we pray that in every city in South Asia, that there will be at least one Christian academic like that? who could be a role model for our students. And then finally, I think the role of a Christian academic would be also to try to ensure that there is continuity in the Christian Student Fellowship. You know, we lack staff workers. We don't have like a staff worker for every university campus. Perhaps we don't even need one. But if there could be a group of Christian academics who meet regularly in a university to support one another, to encourage one another, one thing that they can also do is that with the new batch of Christian students, they can share the vision, just as I have been sharing it with you, of students coming together to form a united fellowship from different church backgrounds to actually support and encourage one another to be loyal stewards of their studies and faithful witnesses to Christ in the way they live, in the way they speak, in the way they relate to students and even to professors in the university. So I will stop here and invite a couple of academics to respond, and then we will open it up to Q&A.
Vinod, can you remove the screen?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Vinod, for sharing. We have two academics from India today, this evening, to respond, and may I invite the younger of both, Dr. Charanjeev Mitra, who's the professor in Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. It's a joy to have him here. So over to Chiranjeev.
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to switch on the video?
It will be better for people.
Okay, once.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, thanks, Vinod, for. So this is something which I have experienced while I was in UK. I was in Cambridge University before, and where actually people from different background, church background as well as discipline, used to come together, and we used to have something called a Christian Graduate Society, in which so that was mostly Christian academics who used to meet. So Graduate Society means it was basically PhD and research scholars and those things. Here, so Professor John would be able to tell more about IIT Kanpur and IIT Bombay. Here we do not have sufficient number of Christians to form a society. There are very few. However, I have a Bible study which I host a Bible study of some students here, but it's not happening right now because all the students have gone because of the lockdown. So, and I have always been telling them about the same things, which similar things which Vinod had been telling, is to when we have Jesus commanded that love the Lord your God with your mind, and that mind includes everything, like we engage our mind. So of course the meaning over there is love the Lord with everything we have, but also to engage our mind in our disciplines as well as to understand the Bible and what it calls us to be a proper, not just witness, but also to excel this academic stewardship, that to excel in our own fields, and by being hardworking and excelling in our disciplines, and at the same time to help others, and that way we will be a good role models. And not everybody will remain in academic, but wherever they go, at least that basics have been instilled in them, that they will carry it forth, and it can help them in their personal evangelism and whatever. But we don't have a society as such, but we have something like just a Bible study, and I have identified some of them who are either born again, or some people may be nominal also, but they also come here and find faith. So that kind of.
Chiranjeev, could you also respond to the fact that as a scholar who is in the classroom with the students, as through sharing, how do you influence them through your discipline? That is something that he also touched upon.
Yes. Well, to be quite honest, physics is a very, very focused discipline in the sense you have equations and things like that. Sometimes people from humanities can find not much room or not much flexibility. But of course, I do keep telling them stories from time to time of people like Newton, and Newton was also a believer. Though I don't share my faith in the classroom, of course, I do it in a more private way. But yeah, so how what they believed in, like Maxwell, of course, and one of the persons who was a very good physicist, and Michael Faraday was also a very committed believer. So so I do tell stories to people, and it's not since this in years of science education, it's not just classroom teaching. I have 5 PhD students under me. 5 have graduated. So I have been, so for them, of course, I have been telling them about my faith, and they see me at work and how I help them. So one of the most important thing is, especially in the Indian context, is that a lot of PhD supervisors misuse their power, and many of them would also, ask them to do personal work, and that is where something I have always not done that, and people would send students to buy milk or vegetables or something like that, which I never do. Of course, if somebody is going there, I will tell, okay, bring something for me. But there are people who engage students in their personal work, and I have always desisted from that. And in my commitment to being honest and to being truthful, so that is where one thing I have always told them, that please do not ever research to plagiarism in research. Even do not, while writing a paper, do not copy anything from anywhere. Have your own originality. So I think, so these are the areas where I think I have been able to be a sort of a role model to tell them. And the PhD students, of course, know about my faith. But in an undergraduate class where there are 200 students, it's not possible to talk about the faith. But when people come closer, I do definitely.
Vinod, do you have anything to ask to Chiranjeev before we go to Dr. Joseph John?
No question, but just a very quick response. You mentioned cheating, which is very prevalent in our universities, plagiarism and cheating.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be good for a Christian teacher, like not only to discipline those students, but also discuss in the classroom what is wrong with plagiarism. What does it do to the people concerned? What about cheating? What does it do not only to the university, but to the wider society?
Yes.
When you have people who cheat and who get degrees and who then get jobs having cheated, and is this the kind of society that we want? Raise those questions, have a discussion, moral philosophy based around cheating, plagiarism, or ragging. That's another issue.
Yeah,
have those kind of conversations with your students.
Thank you, Vinod. Over to Dr. Joseph John, who
before
yeah.
Professor Joseph John pitches in, let me just tell for the benefit of everybody, he was my teacher 25 years ago in IIT Kanpur.
Such a wonderful coincidence. Over to Dr. Joseph John, who is the professor at IIT Mumbai right now, and he was also the president of UESI before the present president took over, and it's such a glad to inform that Dr. Himadri Sinha is also with us today.
Thank you so much, Satish, and also thanks so much to Vinod, and also special thanks to Chiranjeev. Such a joy to see a student after so many years. Let me just respond to some of the things. I fully agree with Vinod when he said about motivation and passion, and I found that makes such a difference. My specialization is electrical engineering, and my specialization is optical fiber communication. So every year I teach this subject. So what I do is I go all the way back to, and I love stories, and I found that all of us love stories. I use the real technical stories to tell them how the transatlantic cable, which was laid in 1848 and how a shark chew it and still people continue to with it. And Alexander Graham Bell, 1876, all these stories and how it developed. And I found that that makes such a difference to them when they study that particular subject. And also, keep bringing the kind of problems related to that particular technology related to just a technical part of it. So motivation, I found that such an important thing, because one of the common questions students ask is that why should I study this subject? So it's all the more important, right? In the first class itself, we tell them why, what is the importance of this subject. And the other thing I fully agree with Vinod about being passionate. And I fully agree, if we don't have that passion, especially if we don't make an eye contact with all the students in the class, and I found that that I fully agree. Yeah, the other thing I just want to talk about was practicing integrity, and this has been one of my problems, especially in a class when there are about, let's say, 40 or 80 students, and some of them disturb you. You find it very difficult. In my initial years, I used to be very critical, sometimes very sharply, and later years I found, but I never publicly apologized. I always went and apologized to them personally. But I think I fully agree with Vinod. So in the recent years, I've also learned that what kind of a negative impact it can have on a student when you publicly kind of criticize him. So these are the things, and I also agree that we're very fortunate. I was at IIT Kanpur for about 27 years. Now, last 10 years, I'm here in IIT Bombay. We were fortunate in both the places to have a fairly large number of students who were part of the fellowship, and also we had faculty. Right now in IIT Bombay also we have Professor Samir Jadhav, is also joined here. In IIT Kanpur also we had
Sundar Manoharan was there, right?
Sundar Manoharan, yeah. So that was very nice. And so that way it was always, so we always have therefore discussions on how do we, so that way it has always been very, very, very rewarding. Just I want to flag about 2-3 problems which I always face, and this may be very unique to India and maybe South Asia. Now, unfortunately, our education system is highly marks oriented or grade oriented. So from day one, the students are trying to see how much grade can I get, rather than so therefore when you give a question paper, when you give an answer sheet, they would try to fight for that half mark. This has always been a challenge, and I always tell them, don't worry, that half mark will not make a difference in your life. The other thing which I find in South Asia, especially in India, I found even in the IITs, is very poor writing skills. And this has been a very constant problem. And I believe our education system, unfortunately, has given too much importance to science and maths in the school, so that they did not give importance to writing skills. So this is another very major area. And copying, unfortunately, happens to be still a serious. Thanks for the comments which Vinod gave. Maybe I'll do that. This has always been a problem. Always been a problem. So somehow by hook or crook to get the marks. This has been. So these are some of the comments I had. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph John. I would go back to Dinesha, who will take up the questions. But before that, Dr. Vinod, do you have any comments to make?
No, thank you. This is very interesting, and I agree. The thing about the students, the whole system of grading, competition, and also the motivation question. I noticed there's a question on the chat from Johan, who is the General Secretary of Focus Sri Lanka, which is connected to that most students study just for economic reasons or family pressure, not out of love for their subject. So two are connected, just studying for the sake of grades or studying for the sake of getting a job or making money. Let me say very quickly that I've noticed this even in the best universities in the world, that even in the Western Ivy League universities, and that the number of students who study because of a love for their subject would be very, very few. They are a tiny minority. But I hope that a Christian teacher who infects students with a love for the subject can change the direction in which the students may go. They may do a particular subject out of family pressure or, for economic reasons, but that doesn't mean that they have to stay in that subject afterwards. I mean, look what happened to me. I studied engineering. I'm not an engineer because my interests widened. And it wasn't so much through exposure to my professors, but by, maybe reading more widely and much wider experiences of life in the university.